My name is Meredith Polsky. I'm the Director of Training and Advocacy for Matan, and this is recognizing and accommodating special needs in the early childhood classroom. So there are a few goals for our time together. One, we want to gain a different understanding of the function of negative behavior in your classroom. Two, we want to understand diagnosed or undiagnosed sensory issues and expressive and receptive language difficulties, and most importantly, how they impact early childhood students and what you as an early childhood educator can do to help in your classroom. And finally, we're going to examine the role that you play in the life of a young Jewish family. Our Jewish tradition has a strong history of inclusion and of making sure that every person is respected regardless of ability or disability. In Proverbs, we read, "Educate each child according to their way." In Pirkei Avot, we learn, "Do not disdain any person. Do not underestimate the importance of anything, for there is no person who does not have his hour, and there is no thing without its place in the sun." And although we have this really strong history of inclusion and respect for every individual, as a Jewish community and as a Jewish educational system, we don't always think about this, and we don't always think about the value of inclusion in the Jewish context. We want to make sure that every young family, especially maybe those who are struggling with a child's newly diagnosed special need or is first starting to understand their child's needs, we want to make sure that they all have a spot in the Jewish community and that they're welcomed and supported. So students misbehave for a variety of reasons. Children don't misbehave just for the sake of being bad. They don't misbehave so that they can be punished. There is a function behind every behavior. So they may be unaware of expectations in the classroom. Even if you think it's been very clear, they may be struggling with something that makes them unaware. They may be seeking to attain power or control. It might feel good to them. They may be receiving some sensory input. They may have a fear of failure. They may be imitating other children in the class. They might be unaware that they are misbehaving. Or they might be unaware of how to exhibit the desired behavior. And they may be using undesirable behavior to achieve other results. And that's really the bulk of what we're going to be speaking about during this webinar. As you know from being in a classroom, behavioral problems can be grouped into basically four main categories. Behavioral problems can be aggressive. These are the children who may appear hyperactive or agitated and unruly. They may be resistant. These are the children who tell you no, or they won't do it, or they can't do it. They may be distractible, those who have a hard time concentrating, or they may be dependent, those children who want adult help all the time. So we really need to understand the function of behavior. Students engage in consistent behaviors because they serve certain functions. The more a teacher recognizes the function of a behavior, the better chance a teacher has of modifying that behavior. So let's use an example. Let's say you see a child hit another child. So of course, hitting is unacceptable in the classroom, and we want to make sure to immediately target that hitting behavior. We immediately approach the child who hit, and we immediately try to extinguish that hitting behavior so that it doesn't happen again. But if we don't know what occurred right before that hitting, we don't know what function it was serving. And chances are, if we don't address what came before and what function the behavior is serving, we're not going to be successful in extinguishing that negative behavior. So we're going to use ourselves as an example. And of course, we're not in a room together, so you're just going to have to think about your answers. But think about how you feel, for example, if you're in a loud, crowded room full of people, or if you're in a working environment and everybody around you is having different conversations on the phone. How do you feel when you taste something really sour? How do you feel on a roller coaster that goes fast and upside down? How do you feel when you enter a room of people you don't know? How do you feel when you go to a party with some people you know and some people you don't? And if we were in a room together, we would see that everybody has different answers to all of these questions, and our students are no exception. This all has to do with how we respond to sensory input. So each of our brains and each of our bodies responds differently to information coming in from the environment. Some people are super aware or hyper aware, and others may barely notice. How we process sensory information in the moment impacts whether or not we can focus our attention. So while most of us probably don't have any sensory disorder, as it's called, sensory integration disorder, it is really important to note that we are sensory beings. At all times of the day, no matter where we are or what we're doing, we have sensory input coming in. It could be the light around us. It could be different sounds. It could be the work that we're doing and how we respond to it. It can be a variety of different things, but we're all sensory beings. So although certainly not all of your children in your classroom will have sensory integration disorder, it's really important to think of each of them as a sensory being and how they're affected by the world around them. So maybe some of this sounds familiar, and maybe you can picture a particular student in your mind. Have you ever encountered students who chew on their hair or their shirt throughout class, or who are always falling out of their chairs or tipping or rocking in their chairs? Those students who refuse to enter places because they are too loud or too crowded, or get upset when another student bumps into or brushes up against them, or those students who fidget and tap and shake their way through the day. This all has to do with what our brains do to process sensory information. So the first thing our brain needs to do is take it in or register it. The second thing it needs to do is make sense out of it and process it. And the third thing it needs to do is respond in an appropriate, adaptive way. So each of us will either seek out more sensory input if we aren't getting enough in order to register, or we may avoid sensory input, possibly even as a fight or flight response. So that child who crashes into things or bounces on their chair is not getting enough input just sitting the way everybody else is. They require more in order to process and make meaning out of their sensory information. So a sensory processing disorder is a condition that exists when sensory signals don't get organized into appropriate responses, and the response that occurs is not adaptive. So what does sensory processing disorder actually look like? Well, a person with SPD finds it difficult to process and act upon information received through the senses, which, as you might imagine, creates real challenges in performing many everyday tasks. I'm going to put on a video, and while the second half of the video focuses more on older children, I think it's really worthwhile to think about how the adaptations that are made for older children with SPD can be implemented in an early childhood classroom. So that gives us a sense of what SPD looks like in the classroom. But I know what we really want to know is what can we do about it? So there are lots of strategies, and some of them, a lot of them will be listed in a document accompanying this webinar that you'll be able to review and also just keep with you as a resource. So I'll mention that whole class movement aids learning. You want to encourage jumping in place, stretching, and hand squeezes, which will help refocus your fidgety students. You can use chair push-ups, power marches, leg raises, foot stomps, knee waves, wall push-ups for sensory input. And you can use active gross motor games to give students a movement break while also incorporating in learning opportunities so that you'll have greater retention and greater understanding of the concepts you're trying to get across. And remember that this is not just about that one student or two students in your class who have trouble with sensory processing. Movement helps the entire class stay focused longer throughout the day and give them the motor breaks that they need. Here are some good examples of fidgets, easily found in dollar stores, Five Below. Doesn't have to be very fancy. I recommend keeping a box of these in your classroom and help children understand when they need what kind of material to help them refocus and reboot during the day. So children with speech and language issues also can have difficulty in the classroom, and we might not always recognize that it's the issues that they're having are really rooted in their speech and language difficulties. So as you know, we have receptive language and we have expressive language. Both include the ability to distinguish and use the correct tone, emotion, or reasoning conducive to the setting. So it's really a lot of things that go into both receptive and expressive speech and language. And the greatest period of growth in speech and language development occurs in preschool children between 2 and 5 years of age. So this is a really critical point in their speech and language development. We know that 5 to 10% of preschoolers experience a speech or language delay. Those delays may be expressive or receptive or both. And as I was saying, a student who has language delays may become frustrated and disruptive in the classroom. However, very small accommodations can go a really long way. So what I'd like you to do is think of a challenging student in your classroom or your school that you have currently or that you've had in the past. And I want you to jot down a typical pattern of behavior for the student that you've identified. And a good way to think about this is to pretend that there's a video camera in your classroom, and you would only see what the video camera sees. So what you write down about a typical pattern of behavior has nothing to do with making a judgment on that behavior or creating a hypothesis about that behavior, but it's really just descriptive, really just what a video camera would be able to pick up. And now we're going to think about behavior assessment in terms of the ABCs, the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. So a functional behavior assessment is conducted to find the function of behavior when a student exhibits patterns of difficult behavior. So the antecedent is what happens immediately before the behavior occurs. The behavior is what it actually looks like, that video camera approach. And the consequence is whatever happens immediately following the behavior. So it's not necessarily the consequence that the teacher imposes, but it's just whatever the result is of that behavior. So for example, let's go back to the child who was hitting, right? Initially, our focus is on addressing the hitting. But if we look at a functional behavior assessment, we may think about this differently. So the antecedent might be that the child is standing in line and the child behind him gets in his space. He can't handle that because the sensory input is too much for him. So he exhibits a fight or flight response, in this case, a fight. And so the behavior that we see is that he hits the child behind him. The consequence is what happens immediately following the behavior. So maybe the consequence in this case is that he's removed from the line. And actually, that's exactly what he needed to have his needs met. He was not standing in line in a place that he was able to adapt to. So if we were looking at this behavior and we wanted to extinguish the hitting behavior, we could tell him till we're blue in the face that we don't hit and there's no hitting in school. But if we give him something adaptive, for example, making sure he stands in the back of the line so nobody can get in his space, then we're actually addressing the function of his behavior. So if you think back to your challenging student and think about it in terms of a functional behavior assessment, you can find the antecedent and the behavior and the consequence. And here I've given you an example, right? The teacher tells the class to check in by writing their name in whatever way they know how. That's the antecedent. The behavior is that Josh starts running around the room making silly faces and noises. And the consequence is that the class laughs. So traditionally, we might target the behavior, the running around the room and making silly faces and noises. But if we start to recognize the antecedent, we might discover that Josh doesn't know how to write his name, or is afraid of failing in that task, or doesn't quite understand the directions. Because the class laughs as the consequence, it may be reinforcing to him to do that again the next time he doesn't understand something, or is afraid of failing, or doesn't quite know what to do. So this model is a good one to keep in mind when you're looking at challenging behaviors within your classroom. The one thing I will say is that as a classroom teacher, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to conduct your own observation to figure out the antecedent and the behavior and the consequence. Whenever possible, you should have another teacher from another class perhaps, or the director of your school, or another professional at the staff. Observe what's going on when that child exhibits that challenging behavior, and even several steps before he starts exhibiting that challenge. Your role as a Jewish early childhood educator is extremely important. You may be the first to notice red flags in a child's development. You may see behaviors in the school environment that parents have never seen. I know oftentimes we'll have conversations with parents and we think maybe they're in denial about the level of their child's issues or the behaviors that they exhibit. But the truth is, these parents really may not have seen those from their children before. They're used to seeing them at home with very little other social interaction, very few expectations in terms of the structure of a classroom and the rules of the classroom and the many transitions that you have throughout your school day. So it really is very entirely possible that the truth is that they have not seen these behaviors that you're seeing in school. They're not in denial. They're not, intentionally being argumentative or not wanting to admit that their child has issues. But you're describing things, and that's the most important thing you can do is describe and not judge and not place value on it, but describing things that the parent really maybe has never seen before. And perhaps most importantly, you really could be the difference between a positive and a negative relationship to the Jewish community. Parents come into Jewish early childhood programs, and many of them have not yet affiliated with the synagogue or have not done anything formal with the Jewish community. This is their first entry point, and we want to make sure that whatever support is required and however we can communicate with them is conducive to helping them feel a part of that Jewish community. Here are some guidelines in terms of that communication. Important things to keep in mind both from a school perspective and from a teacher perspective. So have you met with the family, describing without diagnosing? Do you know the parents' goals for their child, or are you only looking at it from the school's perspective or from the goals of the teacher? Have you asked about and relayed the child's strengths? Are you promoting ongoing open communication and empowering family members by creating opportunities for follow-up and feedback from teachers and parents? Are you maintaining confidentiality? Are you providing ongoing staff development or training, or are you participating in ongoing staff development and training on issues surrounding special needs? And are you fostering an environment at your school where staff work as a team, modeling respectful relationships of equality? All of these things are critical as we think about how we interact with both parents and children particularly around special needs. Thank you so much for being part of this webinar. As I mentioned earlier, alongside this webinar are resources for you to carry with you on both sensory processing disorder and speech language delays, with many lists of milestones, but also strategies for you to implement inside your classroom. So if you're seeing some of these behaviors and if you're having challenges with some of these issues, you can refer to these resources to think about what you can implement in order to help every child be successful in your classroom. Thank you.